The burgundy liquid dripped from my hair onto the white marble floor of Chateau Vermilion, each drop marking time like a countdown I knew my tormentor couldn't possibly comprehend. 8 months pregnant, soaked in what Garrison Thorne had mockingly called cheap wine, I stood perfectly still while the restaurant's wealthy patrons whispered and stared, their shock palpable in the suddenly quiet dining room. But what they saw as humiliation, I recognized as opportunity. What Garrison saw as power, I knew was his greatest weakness. He had no idea who I really was, or what I'd been planning for the past 7 months of working in his establishment. My name is Cordelia Ashworth, though the nameplate pinned to my black uniform simply reads Cora. 22 years old, I've been carrying more than just this baby for the better part of a year. I've been carrying secrets, plans, and a purpose that would have terrified Garrison if he'd possessed even a fraction of the intelligence he believed himself to have. Standing there with Chateau Vermilion's most expensive Bordeaux running down my face, I felt the familiar flutter of my daughter's movement in my belly, as if she too understood that this moment would change everything. "Clean that up," Garrison slurred, gesturing vaguely at the wine spreading across his restaurant's pristine floor. His words carried the particular cruelty that only came with expensive alcohol and inherited privilege. "And dock her pay for the wine. Stupid girl should have known better than to bring me something that cheap." The wine he'd poured over my head had cost $400 a bottle. I knew because I'd memorized every item in his wine cellar, along with his profit margins, his supplier contacts, and his deeply creative approach to tax evasion. But Garrison Thorne, third-generation owner of the city's most prestigious restaurant, saw only what he wanted to see: a pregnant waitress desperate enough to endure his abuse for minimum wage and tips. "Of course, Mr. Thorne," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the wine still dripping from my chin. "I'll take care of it right away." He laughed, that particular sound rich men make when they believe they've demonstrated their superiority over someone they consider beneath them. "That's what I like to hear. Maybe you'll remember this next time you think about bringing me bottom-shelf garbage." The other staff members had frozen in their various tasks, watching this display with the careful neutrality that came from needing their jobs more than their dignity. Maria, the hostess, kept her eyes fixed on her reservation book. James, the sommelier, studied his wine list with sudden intensity. Even Chef Beaumont had emerged from the kitchen, his face a mask of professional detachment that couldn't quite hide his discomfort. But I wasn't uncomfortable. I was calculating. Each drop of wine on the floor represented exactly $16.67 of Garrison's profit margin. The humiliation he thought he was inflicting was actually costing him money, time, and most importantly, witnesses. 23 customers had just watched him assault a pregnant employee. Several had their phones out, though whether they were documenting the scene or simply uncomfortable with the silence, I couldn't tell. "Sir," I said, pulling a small towel from my apron to dab at my face, "would you like me to bring you a different selection from the wine cellar?" Garrison waved dismissively, already losing interest in his victim, now that the immediate thrill of humiliation had passed. "Just bring me something decent this time, and for God's sake, clean yourself up. You look like a disaster." As I bent carefully to begin cleaning the wine from the floor, mindful of my protruding belly, I caught sight of my reflection in the polished marble. 8 months pregnant, wine-stained uniform, kneeling on the floor of someone else's restaurant. To anyone watching, I looked exactly like what Garrison believed I was: powerless, desperate, defeated. It was a performance I'd been perfecting for 7 months, and tonight it would finally pay off. The truth was, I'd been born into this world. Not as a waitress, not as someone who cleaned up other people's messes, but as someone who owned places like this. The Ashworth family had built their fortune in hospitality 3 generations ago, starting with a single hotel in Boston and expanding into a network of luxury properties across the Northeast. My grandfather, Bertram Ashworth, had taught me that the restaurant business was about power, control, and understanding human nature at its most basic level. My father, Constantine Ashworth, had expanded those lessons to include the intricacies of acquisition, investment, and sometimes, when necessary, strategic deception. But none of that showed in my carefully crafted appearance as I worked for Garrison Thorne. I'd spent months perfecting the image of someone who needed this job, someone who would tolerate abuse because she had no other options. I'd practiced the slight hunch of shoulders that suggested defeat, the quick averting of eyes that implied submission, the careful modulation of voice that conveyed just enough desperation to be believable. The pregnancy was real, though. 7.5 months ago, when I'd first discovered I was carrying my daughter, I'd also discovered that the father of my child had been lying to me about nearly everything that mattered. Maximilian Rothschild, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, had presented himself as someone looking for partnership, both personal and professional. What he'd actually been doing was gathering intelligence about my family's business practices, financial vulnerabilities, and expansion plans. Information he'd then sold to our competitors, including Garrison Thorne. The betrayal had cut deeper than I'd expected. Not because I'd loved Max necessarily, but because I'd trusted him with parts of myself I'd never shared with anyone else. My fears about living up to my family's expectations, my uncertainties about whether I had the ruthlessness necessary for our business, my quiet dreams of maybe building something softer and more humane than what my predecessors had created. He'd listened to all of it, encouraged my vulnerabilities, then weaponized them against me. But Max had underestimated me, just as Garrison was doing now. He'd seen my pregnancy as a weakness, an opportunity to marginalize me while he continued his corporate espionage. He'd probably thought I'd retreat to some family estate to have my baby quietly, maybe even be grateful for his attention when he decided to surface again after selling everything he'd learned about my family's operations. Instead, I'd done something neither he nor anyone else had expected. I'd disappeared entirely from my usual circles, assumed the identity I was using now, and gotten a job working for the man who'd been trying to destroy my family's business for the better part of 2 years. Not to spy on him, which would have been the obvious choice, but to study him, to understand how he operated, what motivated him, where his vulnerabilities lay hidden beneath his swagger and inherited wealth. 7 months of bringing Garrison his coffee, serving his preferred meals, listening to his phone conversations and dinner meetings. 7 months of being invisible while he discussed his plans for acquiring my family's properties, his strategies for undermining our vendor relationships, his particular satisfaction at having paid Max for information that had allowed him to outbid us on 3 separate occasions. 7 months of learning that Garrison Thorne, for all his bluster and cruelty, was not nearly as clever as he believed himself to be. Tonight's humiliation wasn't an accident. I'd deliberately brought him the expensive wine, knowing his current state of intoxication would make him react exactly as he had. Every detail had been calculated: the timing, the audience, the wine selection, even my own perfectly submissive response to his abuse. Because in precisely 97 minutes, when the dinner service ended and the restaurant closed to regular customers, Garrison would discover that his stupid pregnant waitress had been recording every conversation, documenting every illegal business practice, and building a case that would destroy him more thoroughly than he'd ever imagined possible. But that revelation was still hours away. For now, I continued cleaning wine from his floor while he held court at table 12, regaling his dinner companions with embellished accounts of his business acumen and inevitable success. The men laughed at his jokes, the women smiled at his charm, and everyone pretended not to notice the pregnant woman kneeling nearby, systematically removing evidence of his casual cruelty. "Cora," Maria whispered as she passed by with a stack of menus, "are you all right? That was awful." I nodded, not trusting my voice to maintain its carefully practiced tremor. Maria was genuinely kind, one of the few people in this place whose concern for me was real rather than performative. She'd been working at Chateau Vermilion for 3 years, supporting her mother and younger sister on her hostess salary, completely unaware that her employer was on the verge of losing everything he'd inherited. "I'm fine," I managed to say, my tone carrying just the right note of exhausted resignation. "It's not the first time." Which was true, though not in the way Maria understood it. Garrison had been escalating his abuse for weeks, as if testing how much I would tolerate before breaking. What he didn't realize was that every incident provided me with more documentation, more evidence of the pattern of behavior that would eventually contribute to his downfall. The wine incident would be particularly useful because it had occurred in front of so many witnesses, several of whom appeared genuinely disturbed by what they'd seen. As I finished cleaning the floor and disposed of the wine-soaked towels, I allowed myself a moment to rest my hand on my belly, feeling my daughter's steady movement. In a few months, she would be born into a world where her mother had proven that patient planning could overcome inherited privilege, that intelligence could triumph over cruelty, that sometimes the person who appeared weakest was actually the one holding all the cards. "Hey," a voice said quietly beside me. I looked up to see James, the sommelier, holding a clean towel and a bottle of water. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the anger simmering beneath his professional demeanor. "This might help." "Thank you," I said, accepting both items. James was in his mid-30s, serious about his craft, and clearly uncomfortable with his employer's behavior. He'd been one of the staff members I'd most carefully observed over the past months, noting his growing discomfort with Garrison's treatment of employees and customers alike. "You don't have to take that kind of treatment," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure Garrison wasn't paying attention to our conversation. "There are other places to work. Better places." I nodded, dabbing at the remaining wine in my hair with the towel he'd provided. "I know, but I need this job right now." With the baby coming, it was the same story I'd been telling everyone for months, and James accepted it with the same mixture of sympathy and frustration I'd grown accustomed to. Good people who wanted to help but couldn't see beyond the surface of my situation, couldn't imagine that someone might choose to endure abuse for reasons that had nothing to do with desperation. "If you ever need a reference," James offered, "or if things get worse." "I appreciate that," I said sincerely, because I did appreciate it, even though I wouldn't need his help in the way he imagined. James was exactly the kind of person I hoped to work with when I eventually rebuilt Chateau Vermilion into something worthy of its reputation and location. Skilled, principled, committed to excellence without cruelty, because that was my plan, ultimately. Not just to destroy Garrison Thorne, but to purchase his restaurant when the legal and financial pressures I was about to unleash forced him to sell. To transform it into the kind of establishment my grandfather would have been proud of, where excellence was achieved through respect rather than fear, where success was built on merit rather than inherited privilege. The dinner service continued around me as I returned to my other duties, taking orders, serving courses, refilling wine glasses with hands that no longer trembled from humiliation, but from anticipation. Garrison had retreated to his private dining room for a business meeting with 3 men I recognized from my research into his operations. They were discussing a real estate acquisition that would require Garrison to significantly overextend his financial resources, a decision that would become particularly problematic when his other revenue streams were suddenly interrupted. By 9:15, the last dinner customers had been served their entrees. By 9:45, dessert orders were being taken. By 10:20, the dining room was beginning to empty, as satisfied patrons settled their bills and made their way out into the cool evening air. And by 10:30, when only Garrison's private meeting remained in progress, I began the final phase of the operation I'd been planning for 7 months. The first step was accessing Garrison's office computer, something I'd been doing periodically for weeks without his knowledge. His password security was laughably inadequate, probably because he'd never imagined that any of his staff possessed the technical skills or motivation necessary to breach his digital files. Tonight, however, I wasn't just gathering information. I was uploading everything I'd collected over the past months to multiple servers, creating backups that would survive any attempt he might make to destroy evidence. Financial records showing systematic tax evasion, employee wage theft, and illegal kickback schemes with vendors. Audio recordings of conversations where he discussed bribing health inspectors, manipulating food safety reports, and deliberately violating labor laws. Video footage from the security cameras I'd secretly installed, documenting his pattern of abusing staff members, particularly young women who he believed were vulnerable to his intimidation. And tonight's wine incident, captured from 3 different angles by cameras he'd never known existed. The second step was sending carefully prepared information packets to the appropriate authorities. The Internal Revenue Service would receive documentation of his tax fraud. The Department of Labor would get evidence of his wage theft and workplace safety violations. The city's Business Licensing Board would learn about his bribery of inspectors. And the local police would receive video evidence of multiple incidents of assault and harassment of employees. But the most important package would go to the media, specifically to investigative reporter Evangeline Cross, whose expose series on corruption in the city's restaurant industry had already resulted in the closure of 3 establishments and the criminal prosecution of their owners. Evangeline had been investigating Garrison for months, but lacked the inside access necessary to build a complete case. Until now. The third step was the most delicate, because it required perfect timing and absolute precision. At exactly 11 o'clock, when Garrison's business meeting concluded and his guests departed, I would hand him my resignation letter, not the tearful, defeated surrender he would expect from the pregnant waitress he'd been abusing, but something that would make him understand, in his final moments of power, exactly what had been happening under his nose. But for now, I continued serving his guests, refilling their water glasses, clearing their plates, maintaining the perfect invisibility that had made this entire operation possible. In the kitchen, Chef Beaumont was already beginning the closing procedures, cleaning stations and storing ingredients with the methodical precision that marked the end of another service. The waitstaff was finishing their side work, counting tips, and preparing to clock out after another night of enduring Garrison's particular brand of leadership. None of them knew that this would be the last normal night Chateau Vermilion would ever have. That by tomorrow morning, their employer would be facing federal charges, their workplace would be under investigation, and their jobs would be in jeopardy not because of anything they'd done, but because of everything he'd done while they watched, helplessly from the sidelines. Some of them, like Maria and James, would find new positions quickly. I'd already begun discreetly networking with other restaurant owners in the city, making sure the good people on Garrison's staff would land safely when his empire collapsed. Others, the ones who'd enabled his worst behaviors or profited from his illegal schemes, would find themselves facing much more difficult circumstances. But that was still hours away. For now, I was still just Cora, the pregnant waitress who'd been humiliated with expensive wine, who cleaned up messes and accepted abuse because she needed the job. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of becoming Cordelia Ashworth again, heir to a hospitality fortune, mother to a daughter who would inherit a world where cruelty was not the price of success. The clock on the kitchen wall showed 10:58 when Garrison's meeting finally began to wind down. His guests were shaking hands, gathering their briefcases, making plans for follow-up conversations. In 2 minutes they would leave, and Garrison would be alone with his staff for the final time. In 2 minutes, I would walk into his office and hand him a letter that would change his life forever. In 2 minutes, he would discover that the fragile girl he'd tormented for sport had been planning his destruction with the patience and precision of someone who'd learned strategy from masters he could never hope to understand. I touched the envelope in my apron pocket, feeling the weight of words that would soon transform Garrison Thorne's understanding of everything he believed about power, control, and the people he considered beneath him. The letter contained information that would make tonight's wine humiliation seem like a gentle caress compared to what was coming. But more than that, it contained the revelation of who I really was, and what his casual cruelty had cost him. The truth was, I hadn't stumbled into this situation by accident or desperation. Every choice I'd made over the past 7 months had been calculated with the precision my grandfather had taught me was essential in the hospitality business. Bertram Ashworth had built our family's empire by understanding that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who appeared weakest, who lulled their enemies into complacency through careful performance of vulnerability. The art of strategic patience, he'd called it during the long summer afternoons he'd spent teaching me about business, sitting in his study overlooking the gardens of our estate in Connecticut. Your enemy will always tell you exactly how to defeat him, Cordelia. You simply have to listen long enough and appear harmless enough for him to reveal his weaknesses. Garrison had been revealing his weaknesses to me for months, completely unaware that his pregnant waitress possessed an MBA from Wharton, fluency in 4 languages, and a trust fund worth more than his restaurant's annual revenue. He'd treated me like his personal victim while I systematically documented every illegal practice, every corrupt relationship, every vulnerable point in his business operations. The pregnancy had actually been an advantage in ways I hadn't initially realized. People saw a woman 8 months pregnant and immediately made assumptions about her capabilities, her priorities, her threat level. They saw someone who would be focused on survival rather than strategy, someone who could be dismissed as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent threat. Even Max, when he'd learned about the pregnancy, had assumed it would derail any plans I might have for professional retaliation. Instead, it had given me the perfect cover for the most comprehensive takedown I'd ever orchestrated. My daughter shifted in my belly as I moved through the dining room, collecting the final wine glasses and coffee cups from Garrison's business meeting. Through the private dining room's glass walls, I could see him shaking hands with his guests, his face flushed with wine and what he believed was impending success. The real estate deal they'd been discussing would require him to leverage nearly everything he owned, based on projected revenues that would never materialize once his legal troubles began. "Cora," Chef Beaumont called from the kitchen doorway, "can you help Maria with the final table settings for tomorrow?" "Of course," I replied, though I knew there would be no service tomorrow. By morning, Chateau Vermilion would be swarming with federal agents executing search warrants, journalists documenting the investigation, and former employees trying to understand how their workplace had become the center of a criminal case. As I arranged tomorrow's table settings with Maria, listening to her excited plans for the weekend, I felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with knowing someone's life was about to change dramatically. Maria was one of the good ones, someone who'd shown me genuine kindness without expecting anything in return. She deserved better than to learn about her employer's criminality through news reports and federal raids. "Maria," I said quietly, "I need to tell you something important." She looked up from the silverware she was polishing, curiosity evident in her dark eyes. "What is it?" "You should start looking for another job. Soon. Tonight, if possible." Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Why? Is everything all right? Are you leaving?" "The restaurant is going to have problems," I said carefully, aware that I couldn't reveal too much without compromising the operation. "Serious problems. You don't want to be here when they start." Maria set down the fork she'd been polishing, studying my face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people through years of customer service. "You know something specific, don't you? This isn't just about tonight, about what Mr. Thorne did to you." I nodded slowly. "I can't explain everything right now, but I promise you, if you trust me on this, you'll thank me later. Call in sick tomorrow. Start making calls tonight. I can give you references for other places, better places." She was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected advice from the pregnant coworker she'd been trying to protect. You're not really just a waitress, are you? The question caught me off guard with its directness. I'd been so focused on maintaining my cover with Garrison and his inner circle that I'd forgotten how perceptive the other staff members could be. Maria had been watching me for months, noticing things I'd assumed were invisible. No, I admitted quietly. I'm not. Are you a cop? FBI? Nothing like that, I assured her. But I am someone who doesn't let people get away with the kind of things Garrison does. And tomorrow, he's going to face consequences for everything he's done. Maria nodded slowly, acceptance replacing confusion in her expression. Thank you for warning me, and thank you for whatever you're doing. He's hurt a lot of people who couldn't fight back. The clock above the bar showed 11 o'clock exactly. Garrison's guests were gathering their coats in the foyer, making final handshakes and promises to follow up next week. In moments, they would be gone, and the restaurant would be empty except for staff and the man who'd built his success on cruelty and corruption. I excused myself from Maria and walked toward Garrison's office, my hand steady on the envelope that would change everything. Through his open doorway, I could see him pouring himself a brandy from the expensive bottle he kept for private celebrations. He was already planning his victory party, completely oblivious to the fact that his empire was about to crumble. "Mr. Thorne," I said, knocking gently on his doorframe. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" He looked up, irritation flickering across his features at the interruption. The wine he'd poured over my head hours earlier had left stains on his shirt and jacket, evidence of his own sloppiness that he'd apparently forgotten in his satisfaction with the evening's business meeting. "Make it quick," he said, not bothering to invite me in. "I have calls to make." I stepped into his office and closed the door behind me, a gesture that made him look up with surprise. In 7 months of working for him, I'd never been bold enough to close his door without permission. The small act of independence clearly caught his attention in a way that suggested some primitive instinct was warning him that something had changed. "I wanted to give you this," I said, pulling the envelope from my apron pocket and placing it on his desk. Garrison stared at the envelope for a moment, then back at me. "What is it?" "My resignation letter." He laughed, the same cruel sound he'd made earlier when pouring wine over my head. "Resignation? After tonight you think you can just quit? After costing me $400 in wine and embarrassing me in front of my customers?" "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said calmly, my voice no longer carrying the tremor of submission I'd been performing for months. "You didn't embarrass yourself because of anything I did. You embarrassed yourself because of who you are." The change in my tone made him sit up straighter, his businessman's instincts finally recognizing that something was fundamentally different about this conversation. "Excuse me?" "Open the letter," I suggested. "I think you'll find it enlightening." Garrison tore open the envelope with movements that were becoming less steady as his alcohol-impaired brain tried to process the shift in dynamic. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and began reading, his expression changing from irritation to confusion to something approaching disbelief. The letter was brief, direct, and devastating. "Dear Mr. Thorne, please accept this as my formal resignation from my position as waitress at Chateau Vermilion, effective immediately. Over the past 7 months, I have thoroughly documented your pattern of criminal behavior, including but not limited to tax evasion, wage theft, bribery of public officials, and systematic abuse of employees. This documentation has been provided to appropriate federal, state, and local authorities, as well as to several media outlets specializing in investigative journalism. You will be hearing from them soon. Additionally, I feel I should introduce myself properly, since we've never been formally acquainted, despite working together for 7 months. My name is Cordelia Ashworth, and I am the majority shareholder of Ashworth Hospitality Group. You may remember us as the company you've been attempting to destroy through corporate espionage and fraudulent business practices. Your efforts in that regard have been unsuccessful. My efforts, however, have exceeded all expectations. Sincerely, Cordelia Ashworth. I watched his face as he read, observed the exact moment when his brain processed the implications of what he was learning. The wineglass in his hand began to tremble, brandy sloshing against the rim as his grip loosened. His eyes moved from the letter to my face and back again, as if he couldn't reconcile the words on the page with the pregnant waitress standing in front of him. "This is a joke," he said finally, his voice lacking conviction. "Some kind of sick joke." "I assure you it's not," I replied, settling carefully into the chair across from his desk. "Though I understand why you might find it difficult to believe. You've spent months assuming that your ability to humiliate me was evidence of your superiority. It's natural that you'd resist accepting the truth." Garrison set down his brandy glass and leaned forward, studying my face with the desperate intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that would save his life. "Cordelia Ashworth is some rich bitch who inherited Daddy's hotel business. You're not." "I am exactly who I've always been," I said quietly. "The difference is that now you're seeing me clearly for the first time, instead of seeing what you wanted to see." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of the cleaning crew finishing their work in the dining room. Garrison's world was collapsing around him, and he was beginning to understand that the woman he'd been tormenting was the architect of his destruction. "The pregnancy," he said suddenly, as if grasping for some element of the situation that still made sense to him. "That's real. You're really pregnant." 8 months, I confirmed. "My daughter will be born into a world where people like you face consequences for their actions." His face was growing paler as the full implications began to sink in. "You've been recording me, spying on me." "Documenting you," I corrected. "Everything you've done, everything you've said, every illegal practice you've engaged in during my employment here. 7 months of evidence that will ensure you spend the next several years in federal prison." Garrison pushed back from his desk and stood abruptly, panic beginning to override his shock. "You can't do this. I'll fight it. I'll prove you're lying." "With what evidence?" I asked, remaining seated. "Your thoroughly compromised computer system, your falsified financial records, the testimony of employees you've been abusing for years, the witnesses who watched you assault a pregnant woman with a $400 bottle of wine just hours ago." He began pacing behind his desk, his movements erratic as desperation took hold. "Nobody will believe you. A pregnant waitress making accusations against a successful businessman. It's absurd." "You're right that it would be absurd," I agreed, "if I were actually a pregnant waitress making desperate accusations. But I'm not. I'm the heir to a hospitality fortune who spent 7 months gathering evidence of your criminal enterprise. And tomorrow morning, when federal agents execute their search warrants, they'll find everything they need to build a case that will destroy you." The color had completely drained from Garrison's face. He stopped pacing and gripped the back of his chair, as if needing physical support to remain upright. "What do you want? Money? A settlement? There has to be something you want." "I want justice," I said simply. "For every employee you've cheated, every person you've humiliated, every law you've broken while believing you were untouchable. And I want to make sure this never happens again." "This is about revenge," he accused, his voice rising with hysteria. "Because of what happened tonight, because I embarrassed you." I shook my head slowly. "Tonight was just the final piece of evidence I needed. This has been building for 7 months, since the day I started working for you and realized that everything I'd heard about your business practices was actually worse than reported." Garrison collapsed into his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him as he fully grasped the scope of what was happening. "Cordelia Ashworth," he repeated quietly, as if testing the name against his memories of the past months. "You've been playing me this entire time." "I've been learning from you," I corrected. "Understanding how you operate, documenting your methods, building a comprehensive case that will ensure you face full consequences for your actions. He looked at me then with something that might have been respect if it hadn't been so thoroughly mixed with terror. You won't get away with this. Entrapment, illegal surveillance. I'll find a way to fight back. You're welcome to try, I said, rising from my chair. But I should mention that everything I've done has been completely legal, and I've had excellent legal counsel throughout this process. The same cannot be said for your activities over the past several years. As I moved toward his office door, Garrison made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Wait, he called out. Your baby. Think about your baby. Do you really want to put yourself through the stress of a court case while you're pregnant? We can work something out. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, turning back to face the man who'd just tried to use my unborn daughter as a bargaining chip. My daughter will grow up knowing that her mother fought for justice when it mattered, that she didn't let people get away with cruelty just because it was easier to stay quiet. This will ruin me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I agreed. It will. But you did that to yourself, Garrison. Every choice you made, every person you hurt, every law you broke. I just made sure there would be consequences. I opened the office door and stepped back into the restaurant's main dining room, where the cleaning crew was finishing their work and my fellow staff members were clocking out after another shift. Tomorrow, their workplace would be a crime scene. By next week, most of them would be working elsewhere. But tonight, they were still just employees of a man who'd built his success on the suffering of others. The cool evening air hit my face as I walked out of Chateau Vermilion for the final time, wine still staining my uniform, my daughter moving restlessly in my belly, as if she too sensed that something fundamental had just changed. Behind me, through the restaurant's large windows, I could see Garrison still sitting at his desk, staring at the resignation letter that had just destroyed his world. In 12 hours, when the first federal agents arrived with their search warrants, he would understand that tonight's humiliation had been just the beginning. But for now, he was alone with the knowledge that the fragile girl he'd tormented had been planning his destruction with a patience and precision that would have impressed my grandfather. The street was quiet as I walked to my car, the city settling into its late-night rhythm around me. Tomorrow would bring investigations, arrests, media coverage, and the complex process of rebuilding something better from the ruins of Garrison's empire. But tonight, for the first time in 7 months, I could drop the performance of vulnerability and simply be who I'd always been. Cordelia Ashworth, daughter of Constantine, granddaughter of Bertram, soon-to-be mother of a little girl who would inherit a world where justice was possible, even when it required extraordinary patience to achieve. My phone began ringing before I'd even reached my car, the screen displaying Evangeline Cross's name in bright letters against the darkness. The investigative reporter had been waiting for this call, and her excitement was palpable even through the digital connection. Cordelia, she said without preamble, please tell me you have everything we discussed. Everything and more, I confirmed, settling carefully into the driver's seat of my modest Honda Civic, another piece of the performance I'd been maintaining for months. The documentation is already uploading to the secure servers. You'll have access within the hour. And Thorne, does he know? He knows, I said, starting the engine and pulling away from Chateau Vermilion for the final time. Though I suspect he's still processing the implications. Evangeline's laugh carried genuine admiration. 7 months of undercover work while 8 months pregnant. That's either brilliant or completely insane. Perhaps both, I admitted, navigating the quiet streets toward my temporary apartment across town. But effective. The apartment I'd been living in was nothing like the family estate where I'd grown up, or even the penthouse I'd maintained before beginning this operation. It was a carefully chosen space in a middle-class neighborhood, furnished with items from discount stores, designed to support the fiction that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a young woman with limited resources and even more limited options. But tonight, As I climbed the stairs to the second-floor unit I'd called home for 7 months, I felt the weight of that performance beginning to lift. Tomorrow, the world would know who I really was. The federal raids would begin at dawn, search warrants would be executed, and Garrison Thorne's empire would start its very public collapse. My phone rang again as I unlocked my apartment door. This time, the caller was my father, Constantine Ashworth, whose distinctive voice carried across the connection with characteristic authority. "Cordelia," he said, "I trust everything went according to plan." "Better than expected," I replied, settling onto the modest couch that had been my primary relaxation space for months. "Garrison provided us with additional evidence tonight that will make the case even stronger." "The wine incident," my father said, and I could hear the controlled anger in his voice. "Evangeline's contact at the restaurant sent preliminary footage. That man's arrogance may have just guaranteed his conviction." Constantine Ashworth was not someone who forgave easily, particularly when it came to threats against his family. When we'd first discovered the extent of Garrison's attacks on our business, and more specifically, the role that Maximilian Rothschild had played in providing him with inside information, my father's initial impulse had been to respond with overwhelming legal force, immediate lawsuits, criminal complaints, federal investigations launched through our political connections. It had taken considerable persuasion to convince him that my approach would be more effective. That patient documentation of ongoing crimes would build a stronger case than pursuing individual incidents. That allowing Garrison to believe he was winning would make him careless enough to provide us with evidence of much larger violations. "The pregnancy complicated things," my father continued, "but perhaps it was actually an advantage." "It was," I confirmed. "Nobody suspects a pregnant woman of orchestrating their downfall. The vulnerability was too obvious, too complete." "And the child's father? Have you decided how to handle Maximilian?" The question I'd been avoiding for months. Max's betrayal had cut deeper than professional sabotage because it had been so thoroughly personal. He'd courted me for 18 months, convinced me to trust him with information about our family's business plans, our financial strategies, our expansion timeline. Information he'd then sold to Garrison and others who were actively working to destroy us. "Max will face his own consequences," I said carefully, "though his situation is more complex than Garrison's." Because Max hadn't just been selling information to our competitors. My investigation into his activities had revealed something much more systematic, much more dangerous. He'd been running what amounted to a corporate espionage network, targeting multiple families in our industry, gathering intelligence that he then auctioned to the highest bidders. The Ashworth family had been just one of several victims, though perhaps the most profitable due to his intimate access to our planning. "Complex how?" my father asked, his tone sharpening with the protective instinct that had made him such a formidable businessman. "He's been working with people beyond just Garrison," I explained. "Federal investigators will find connections to organized crime figures, international money laundering operations, even some foreign interests that have been trying to gain footholds in American hospitality markets." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Constantine Ashworth had built our family's fortune through legitimate business practices, but he understood the criminal underworld well enough to recognize the danger Max's activities represented. "How deep does it go?" he asked finally. "Deep enough that the FBI has been building a case for 2 years, I said. My documentation of Garrison's operations was just the final piece they needed to move against the entire network. It was true, though not complete. The federal investigation had been initiated because of information I'd provided through carefully established back channels. Information gathered not just during my 7 months as a waitress, but through an even longer period of investigation that had begun the moment I'd discovered Max's betrayal. "When does it start?" my father asked. "Tomorrow at dawn," I confirmed. Simultaneous raids in 6 cities. Garrison's restaurant is just the beginning. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message as we spoke, and I glanced at the screen to see an update from one of the federal agents coordinating tomorrow's operations. Everything was proceeding according to schedule. Search warrants had been signed, arrest teams were in position, and media outlets were prepared to document the largest hospitality industry corruption case in decades. "I'm proud of you," my father said quietly, his voice carrying an emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "Your grandfather would have been proud too." Bertram Ashworth had died 3 years earlier, but his influence on our family's approach to business remained profound. He'd taught me that true power came not from inherited wealth or political connections, but from understanding human nature well enough to anticipate how people would behave under pressure. The lesson that had made tonight's operation possible. "He taught me that patience was a weapon," I said, touching my belly where my daughter continued her restless movement. "That sometimes the best revenge was simply allowing people to destroy themselves while you documented the process. And tomorrow, the documentation becomes public," my father observed with satisfaction. After ending the call with my father, I spent the next several hours monitoring the secure channels that would track tomorrow's operations. By midnight, I had confirmation that federal agents were in position outside Chateau Vermilion, and 5 other locations connected to the conspiracy. By 2 in the morning, arrest warrants had been finalized for Garrison, Max, and 14 other individuals involved in the network. But it wasn't until 3:30, when my phone rang with a call from an unknown number, that I realized the night's revelations weren't quite finished. "Cordelia," the voice said, and I immediately recognized Max's distinctive accent, though it now carried a tremor I'd never heard before. "We need to talk." "I don't think we do," I replied, though curiosity kept me on the line. "Please," he said, desperation evident in his voice. "I know what's happening tomorrow. I know what you've done. But there are things you don't understand about the situation." "Such as?" "Such as the fact that I've been working with federal investigators for the past 8 months, he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Everything I did, everything I told Garrison and the others, was part of a larger operation." The claim was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything I believed about the situation, that for a moment I couldn't process it. "That's impossible." "I've been undercover," Max continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "The pregnancy, your investigation, everything that's happened between us, it wasn't supposed to go this far. But when I realized you were pregnant, when I understood how deep you were getting into Garrison's operations, I couldn't break cover without compromising everything." "You're lying," I said, though doubt was beginning to creep into my certainty. "Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI White Collar Crime Division," Max said. "Call her. She'll confirm everything." I ended the call without responding, my mind racing through the implications of what he'd claimed. If Max had been working with federal investigators, if his betrayal of our family had been part of an authorized operation, then everything I thought I understood about the past year was wrong. But it would also mean that my daughter's father wasn't the criminal I'd believed him to be. That the man I'd fallen in love with before discovering his supposed betrayal might actually be someone worthy of that emotion. My hands shook as I dialed the number Max had provided, reaching Agent Martinez's voicemail and leaving a carefully worded message requesting confirmation of information I'd received regarding an ongoing federal investigation. The response came back within minutes, a text message providing a secure phone number and instructions for a conversation that would change everything I thought I knew about my situation. "Ms. Ashworth," Agent Martinez said when I called the secure line. "I've been hoping we'd have this conversation for months. Mr. Rothschild has been one of our most valuable assets in the investigation you've been supporting." "Supporting?" I asked, confusion replacing the certainty I'd maintained for so long. "Did you think it was coincidence that you were able to get a job at Chateau Vermilion so easily?" Agent Martinez asked. "That Garrison never ran a thorough background check on his new waitress?" That his computer security was so inadequate that you could access his files without detection? The questions hit me like physical blows as I realized the implications. You've been facilitating my investigation. Mr. Rothschild has been facilitating your investigation, Agent Martinez corrected. Everything he told Garrison and the others, every piece of information he provided about your family's business, was carefully designed to make them believe they were winning, while actually leading them into increasingly compromising positions. But the damage to our business has been minimal and easily reversible, Agent Martinez said. The contracts they thought they'd stolen were decoys. The expansion plans they believed they'd derailed were never real. Rothschild made sure that any actual damage was negligible while maintaining his credibility with the criminal network. I sank into my modest apartment's single armchair, overwhelmed by the revelation that everything I'd believed about Max's betrayal had been wrong. How long has this been going on? 2 years, Agent Martinez said. Mr. Rothschild came to us when he first discovered the scope of the criminal network targeting hospitality businesses. His pharmaceutical background gave him access to money laundering operations we'd been trying to penetrate for years. And our relationship was never part of the operation, Agent Martinez assured me. His feelings for you, your pregnancy, your decision to go undercover at Garrison's restaurant, all of that was real, which made it incredibly difficult for him to maintain his cover while protecting you. The weight of this revelation was almost too much to process. For 7 months, I'd been planning Garrison's downfall while believing that my daughter's father was one of the criminals I was fighting against. The anger that had fueled my patience, the desire for revenge that had sustained me through months of humiliation, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Why didn't he tell me? I asked, though part of me already understood the answer. Because the operation was too sensitive, Agent Martinez explained, and because your genuine anger, your authentic desire for revenge, made your performance more convincing than any acting could have been. Garrison never suspected that his pregnant waitress was working against him because your hatred of him was absolutely real. My phone buzzed with another incoming call, and I saw Max's number on the screen. This time, when I answered, everything between us had changed. Cordelia, he said softly, I know this is a lot to process. 8 months, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I've spent 8 months believing you betrayed us. I know, he said, pain evident in his voice. And I've spent 8 months watching you put yourself in danger while being unable to protect you without compromising an investigation that could save dozens of other families from what we thought Garrison was doing to yours. Our daughter, I said, my hand moving instinctively to my belly. She's going to be born thinking her father is a criminal. No, Max said firmly. She's going to be born knowing that both her parents fought for justice, even when it meant sacrificing their own happiness to protect others. The federal raids began at exactly 6 in the morning, just as the first light was breaking over the city. I watched from my apartment window as black SUVs surrounded Chateau Vermilion, federal agents streaming into the building with search warrants and evidence collection equipment. By 7, Garrison Thorne was in handcuffs, being led from his restaurant while news cameras captured every moment of his downfall. The media coverage was everything Evangeline Cross had promised and more. By noon, the story was national news, with footage of the wine incident playing on every major network, alongside explanations of the broader conspiracy that had been uncovered. Garrison's humiliation of his pregnant waitress had become the symbolic centerpiece of a story about corporate corruption and federal justice. But the most satisfying moment came at 2 in the afternoon, when I received a call from Garrison's lawyer requesting a meeting to discuss potential cooperation with federal investigators. The man who'd poured wine over my head 12 hours earlier was now desperate to provide information about his criminal associates in exchange for a reduced sentence. He wants to meet with you specifically, the lawyer explained. He says you're the only person who might have enough influence with federal prosecutors to help his situation. I agreed to the meeting, though not for the reasons Garrison's lawyer imagined. I wanted to see him one more time, to let him understand fully what his casual cruelty had cost him. The federal building's conference room was sterile and cold, much like the courtroom where my parents had been ambushed with fake custody papers in one of the stories I'd heard growing up. Garrison sat across from me in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, his face bearing the unmistakable signs of a man who'd spent the night contemplating the destruction of everything he'd believed about his life. "You played me," he said without preamble, his voice carrying none of the arrogance I'd endured for 7 months. "I documented you," I corrected, the same response I'd given him the night before. "You played yourself." "The federal charges," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "They're saying I could face 20 years, maybe more." "That sounds about right," I agreed. "Tax evasion, racketeering, assault, wage theft, bribery. You've been busy." Garrison leaned forward, his shackles clanking against the metal table. "There has to be something you want. Some way we can work this out." "There is something I want," I said, pulling a folder from my briefcase and placing it on the table between us. "I want to buy your restaurant." His expression shifted from hope to confusion to something approaching despair. "Buy it?" "Chateau Vermilion will be going up for auction when the federal government seizes your assets," I explained. "I intend to be the highest bidder." "You want to take everything from me," he said, understanding beginning to dawn. "I want to transform everything you built on cruelty into something worthy of its location and reputation," I corrected. "I want to employ people like Maria and James and Chef Beaumont in an environment where excellence is achieved through respect rather than fear." The federal auction of Garrison's assets took place 6 weeks later, on a crisp morning in November when my pregnancy had reached its final stages. I attended in person, my identity now fully public, my purpose completely transparent. The bidding was competitive, with several major hospitality groups interested in acquiring such a prestigious location. But I had advantages they couldn't match: intimate knowledge of the property's systems, relationships with the existing staff, and most importantly, a vision for what the restaurant could become that went beyond simple profit margins. When the auctioneer's gavel fell, confirming my successful bid, I felt the same satisfaction I'd experienced 7 months earlier when I'd first walked into Garrison's office as a pregnant waitress seeking employment. The circle was complete, but the real work was just beginning. My daughter, Beatrice Constantine Ashworth, was born 3 weeks later on a snowy December morning that seemed to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Max was there for the birth, our relationship rebuilt on the foundation of truth rather than the deception that had characterized so much of the previous year. Holding Beatrice for the first time, seeing her perfect features and feeling her tiny fingers grasp mine with surprising strength, I understood that everything I'd endured over the past months had been preparation for this moment. She would grow up knowing that justice was possible, that patient planning could overcome inherited privilege, that sometimes the people who appeared weakest were actually the ones holding all the cards. The renovation of what would become Ashworth Vermilion took 4 months, during which I worked closely with Chef Beaumont, James, and Maria to create something entirely new from the bones of Garrison's empire. We kept the elegant dining room and the prestigious location, but transformed the culture entirely. Fair wages, profit sharing for staff, a commitment to sourcing ingredients from local suppliers who shared our values. The grand reopening took place on a warm evening in May, exactly 1 year after I'd first walked into Garrison's office seeking employment. The guest list included food critics, local dignitaries, federal agents who'd worked on the case, and most importantly, every member of the staff who'd shown me kindness during my months of undercover work. Maria served as our new general manager, her natural warmth and organizational skills making her perfect for the role. James had been promoted to head sommelier and beverage director, his expertise finally receiving the recognition it deserved. Chef Beaumont remained in charge of the kitchen, but now worked with a staff who respected rather than feared him. The evening's most meaningful moment came when Agent Martinez arrived with a special guest, Garrison Thorne, serving the final months of his sentence through a work release program that allowed him to see firsthand what his former restaurant had become. He worked that night as a dishwasher, the same position where many great careers in hospitality begin, learning for the first time what it meant to be the person at the bottom of the hierarchy he'd once controlled. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said to me during a quiet moment in the kitchen, his hands red from hot water and soap. "But I want you to know that I understand now what I was." "Understanding is the first step," I replied, watching him work with the same careful attention I'd once given to serving his meals. "What you do with that understanding will determine who you become." Max proposed to me 6 months later, on the anniversary of the night federal raids had brought down the criminal network we'd both been fighting. We were married in a small ceremony at my family's estate in Connecticut, with Beatrice sleeping peacefully in her grandmother's arms, while we exchanged vows that had been earned through months of separation and misunderstanding. The Ashworth hospitality empire continued to grow, but with a different philosophy than the one that had characterized previous generations. We focused on businesses that elevated their communities rather than simply extracting profit from them. Restaurants that paid living wages, hotels that supported local artisans, event spaces that celebrated rather than exploited their cultural contexts. But perhaps the most satisfying development came 2 years later, when I received a call from Evangeline Cross about a new investigation she was pursuing. Another hospitality company was engaging in the same kind of predatory practices that had characterized Garrison's operations, and she wondered if I might be interested in providing assistance. "Not undercover work," she clarified quickly. "You have a daughter now, responsibilities that didn't exist during the Chateau Vermilion operation." "What kind of assistance?" I asked, though I was already considering the possibilities. "Strategic consultation," Evangeline explained. "Help us understand how these operations work from the inside. Provide context that only someone with your background could offer." It was the beginning of what would become a new aspect of my professional life, working with federal investigators and journalists to expose corruption in industries where workers were too vulnerable to fight back on their own. Using the skills my grandfather had taught me, the patience my father had modeled, and the sense of justice my daughter would inherit. 5 years after the night Garrison poured wine over my head, I stood in the completely transformed dining room of Ashworth Vermilion, watching my daughter take her first steps across the polished marble floor where I'd once knelt to clean up, evidence of someone else's cruelty. The restaurant around us thrived not because we exploited our workers or cut corners on quality, but because we'd proven that excellence and ethics could coexist profitably. Beatrice stumbled and caught herself against one of the tables, her laughter echoing through the dining room where some of the city's most important business was now conducted with transparency rather than corruption. She would grow up understanding that power carried responsibility, that success should lift others rather than crushing them. The wine stain on my uniform had been washed away years ago, but the memory of that humiliation remained as clear as ever. Not because it had damaged me, but because it had revealed everything I needed to know about the man who'd thought he could break me. The pregnant waitress he'd tormented had been stronger than he'd imagined, more patient than he'd understood, and infinitely more dangerous than he'd ever suspected. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads you exactly where you need to be, just as my grandmother's letter had promised in the story that had inspired my own approach to justice. Garrison Thorne had thought he was demonstrating his power when he poured wine over a vulnerable woman's head. Instead, he'd been sealing his own fate, providing the final piece of evidence that would transform his victim into the architect of his downfall. The fragile girl he'd humiliated had done exactly what she'd promised in those crucial 2 minutes after his assault. She'd changed everything, forever.